Dr. Daniel Martins, welcome to the show.
Well, a pleasure to be here. I'm glad to discuss these topics with you today.
Amazing. Let's start with a bit about you, a bit about your background then. So, obviously, you're a researcher at King's College London, but I would love to hear a little bit about what got you into neuroscience and why it is that you became interested and fascinated with the brain and then long COVID in general.
That's a very good question, actually, for a start. As you know, I am a medical doctor. That's my background. That's where I studied. I started in the area of medicine and psychiatry, and I think since I was a child, I always liked a very good puzzle. And I realized with my experience in medicine and in science that there's probably not bigger puzzle than the brain. It's probably an organ where you can try to get to know as much as you want about it, but you will never be more than scratching the surface of whatever is happening with this fantastic machine that operates us in a way that is absolutely fantastic. So I think that's really my passion. And to be honest with you, I don't think that I would see myself doing anything else other than doing biological psychiatry and neuroscience and the research that I do. The long COVID, I think, it was a bit my commitment to the medicine, actually speaking at the time. So by the time that the pandemic started, I was finishing my PhD. I started writing my thesis more or less right in the beginning of the lockdown, and always felt a bit like a bit in discomfort by the fact that I could not have the disponibility to help the rest of the NHS team. And the moment that I saw so many people struggling and getting to know not only the statistics but getting to know the faces that constitute these statistics, I realized that maybe that was my time of trying to contribute and pay a bit with delay what I would have liked to have done when the pandemic started. So I think was kind of a bit of a sense of a mission that I had at that time, and since then, a good puzzle is a good puzzle.
I think that's very. If you're looking for a good puzzle, then I think long COVID is a fantastic place to start, and that's amazing. That's really nice to hear out of the sense of duty as well. I think that's very much and on behalf of a lot of people who have been struggling, it's very much appreciated. So thank you for doing that work. Um, so I think we can just dive straight in then with the long COVID research that you've been doing. So
Mhm.
obviously you've had a number of papers that have been released over the years. A lot of really interesting stuff. And I know that in the next few days you're going to be presenting the initial findings of this long COVID research that you guys have been doing using neuroimaging and finding out more about what's going on in the brain. I was saying to you beforehand, I was actually looking for the paper, but it's not it's not out yet. So
We will hopefully be releasing a preprint very soon. So for the first stuff that I will be presenting actually on Thursday, but there will be also more stuff coming that has not been presented before.
amazing. So the viewers on this channel are getting a real early access, then, aren't they, to to a bit of the research. So I wondered if you could dive into the research, tell us what it's about, and dive into some of the findings, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you probably have noticed already, I work in the Department of Neuroimaging. And for people that do neuroimaging, what we really like is to see things. So we like to use these very expensive machines that give you the possibility of actually really looking into, sometimes with an impressive amount of detail, into the several aspects of the physiology and structure of the brain. And one of the advantages of doing that is that you can very easily with these techniques, and when I talk about these techniques, mostly I'm talking about magnetic resonance imaging, MRI. You can very easily scan someone multiple times without have any sort of risk. And the other thing is that you can very easily also use the same techniques in animal models, which means that you can with a degree of facility, very easily translate what you get to know from the humans then into preclinical models and vice versa. So I'm kind of a bit obsessed with this idea of like having this technique that allows me to maybe get a start with the humans where most of the times it's very difficult to jump into animals without knowing exactly what is it that we are trying to model, which long COVID is a very good example. It's an emergent condition where we don't really know any sort of mechanism, and where we necessarily need to have an understanding of what is it that might be going on before we can jump into the modeling of the condition. But the advantage of neuroimaging is really this, is the precision in the capacity that these techniques give you of getting to know a lot about several areas of the brain in a relatively short of time. And then once you get to know more or less where in space things are, you can start to then go a bit more into detail, let's say. Um, this idea of the neuroinflammation, which has been pretty much like the most important concept behind our research at King's, the research that I lead there, is pretty much a concept that we are kind of borrowing from a condition that is very similar, and that is called ME/CFS, so myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, which, as you probably know, and many of the people listening to us today will probably know, is a condition that is also characterized by fatigue, by cognitive deficits. So what we typically call brain fog, it's kind of a concept that we all use, but we don't really know, or we don't have an operational definition of brain fog is. But let's say it cognitive deficits in general. And then it might be related to a number of other things, like, for example, pain, chronic pain, alterations of the autonomic nervous system. So it's pretty much around this concept. And what did we know already about the ME/CFS? Well, we knew that, first of all, it seems to be a condition that was kind of not very well understood, probably as much neglected as it could be over the past years. Um, but there were some concepts or some ideas that, in general, it seems that these patients showed some signs of neuroinflammation. But when we talk about neuroinflammation, it's not a typical neuroinflammation that you would see, for example, in encephalitis, or something that is really would, let's say, put a doctor in that is doing a knee between startled. We are talking about probably a level of low grade chronic neuroinflammation that is just lingering there, that stays over time and persists. And that, even though it's not sufficient to give you like an acute medical clinical presentation that would justify an admission, it's probably enough to disrupt the functioning of your brain in a way that is probably going to justify why people have all of this fatigue, why people have all of this post-exertional malaise, which happen not only physically but also cognitively, and also many other symptoms. So it was a bit trying to borrow the concept from there and apply it here in long COVID.
So you're saying the inflammation then is likely what is potentially a trigger to that post-exertional malaise, because I know exactly what you mean, where it's not just necessarily physical stuff, but it's this, and for many people, in fact, it's actually the mental side of things is worse. So doing some kind of exercise for some people is okay to a degree, but
Mm-hmm.
then if they were to stare at a computer screen for too long, or if they were to do a serious amount of work or studying, absolute write off, and they'll be suffering for days.
Yeah, I mean, what we say cognitive fatigue, for example, it's a dimension, and it's as physical as physical fatigue.
Mm.
It's just that when we talk about physical fatigue, we are talking more about, the body itself and the sort of exercise related or muscle activation related thing. When we talk about cognitive fatigue, we talk about essentially using your brain in some sort of cognitive operation. So mathematical operations, or having to keep your attention focused on something for a long period of time, which, to be fair, both have a similarity here, which is the fact that they both need energy to just keep going. Your mitochondria in the brain will not need any less energy than the mitochondria in the muscle in order to keep the synaptic activity just going on. So it's kind of a similar concept there. And that was something that we already knew from the ME/CSF literature. So that is not the classical, let's say, neuroinflammation that we are used to see in multiple sclerosis, for example. It's probably something a bit milder, a bit involving other players of the immune system and also of the central immune system, so the cells in the brain that actually have to deal with the immune activity, but that is probably sufficient to cause some sort of a triggering. And you are correct that this concept of post-exertional malaise, I think it's pretty much we can very much root it in the concept of a stressor. And it's sort of, let's say, even an emotional stress is sufficient to put a strain, physiological strain on your body. I don't know if you ever heard about the concept of the syndrome of the broken heart.
I have heard of it. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it's actually, cardiologically speaking, it's a condition that can be quite severe, but that is basically just caused by a very strong emotional stressor. Um, and that exemplifies very well how sometimes this dichotomy that we try to establish between what is mind and what is body is probably not as useful as we think that it might be.
Hmm.
So,
I,
and a stressor is a stressor. That's what I meant. And it's
because
going to
isn't
put
there
a strain.
there's the case, isn't there, where the I think it's from broken heart syndrome, where it's actually quite common that certainly in older couples, if one of them were to pass away, then the other, there's a very high correlation between the likelihood of them then passing away quite soon after. Is that the same thing? Is that the thing that you're talking about?
No, it's actually something that we call a cardiomyopathy of Takotsubo. It's something very complicated that basically changes the way your heart contracts, and that's normally startled by a very let's say very strong emotional reaction to something, which can be a loss. So it's actually something that can be related. Um, you are almost calling my side of my psychopharmacology side with the intranasal oxytocin and the role of oxytocin in the formation of attachment. But I think it's a good example of how we need to start to learn and perhaps revise a bit our very old and strong concepts of things, including this dichotomy of what is mind, what is body.
Yeah.
As a psychiatrist, I like to see or think as myself as a psychiatrist that normally works from the neck below. So someone that is really thinking about the brain and thinking about the mind or the psyche as existing in a body.
Hmm.
And that's also why one of the reasons why I've been so keen on these medically unexplained symptoms such as the fatigue and the ME/CFS and the long COVID, because it's really something that I think it's been a bit plagued historically by the fact that this dichotomy was present in the beginning of the specialty, and that nowadays I honestly don't think that it's probably a very useful concept.
Hmm.
We need to start thinking that a lot of things that happen in the brain are influenced by the body,
Hmm.
and vice versa. So that's the only way we will probably have to advance a bit further, because otherwise we are just stuck with these old concepts that so far have not really produced many results.
Very true. Very true. I think that's why you have a lot of the yeah, this kind of unhelpful split, this unhelpful kind of stigmatization as well, and this inability to understand that they both very much work as one. It's not like you said; it's not just two isolated systems. They're very much one conjoined system that influences everything. So, in
Yeah,
the likelihood of what you said, if you're having that kind of low grade inflammation, then that obviously has a lot of knockdown
yeah,
effects.
yeah.
Is that something then that you found, and that was like it within the research then?
Yeah, so one of the things that, for example, our data, and even though we are still finalizing some of the analysis that we are doing, but something that seems to be quite screaming in the data is the contribution of these cells, which are metabolic players and the metabolic card keepers of the brain, which are called astrocytes, the stars of the brain. And what do we know? Well, we knew already from the postmortem studies done in people with COVID or with long COVID that for some reason, when the virus could be identified in the postmortem tissue, there was some sort of preference for the virus to be infecting these cells. If you in vitro infect astrocytes with SARS-CoV-2 and then take the medium that is from these cells and expose neurons to this medium, you replicate some sort of deficits in terms of neural activity that we see in someone with long COVID. And I can tell you that the regions in the brain where we typically see these reductions in thickness in the cortex of people with long COVID, because our data is also very clear on that. So these are reductions that are effective, that are objective. It's not, there's no subjectivity here.
Hmm.
Typically, they tend to occur in regions of the brain that we know by definition to have higher percentage of astrocytes in their composition. So, as a constitutive way, these regions typically do show higher percentage of astrocytes. So you start to see like how piece by piece we now have a technique, neuroimaging, which gives us like a kind of a macroscopical picture of things, but then we also have the post-mortem brain tissue that tells us that well, astrocytes might be important. Neuroimaging is telling us, well, the astrocytes might be important. You know, perhaps there's something there that we might need to explore a bit further.
Okay, so the indication from this then is that potentially there's viral debris. Is that active virus or viral debris that is kind of getting into certain parts of the brain in the astrocytes, and that's causing this kind of deficit?
So we do not see necessarily viral particles in neuroimaging. It's the sort of detail we don't really have to with this sort of techniques. Just
Okay.
to be clear, but something that we can do, for example, is to measure the thickness of your cortex. So once I have your MRI of your brain, I can just process it using a software that is going to basically project that into a 3D space and create some sort of a 3D model of your brain. And that will allow us then to calculate what the thickness of the different layers of your cortex are in different parts of the brain. And for example, in people with long COVID, what we have found and what other people have also found is that typically these regions of the orbital frontal cortex, so it would be like the region that you have sitting here on the very close to your nose, they decrease. Yeah. So there's apparently this region, the orbital frontal cortex, which is very much connected with the olfactory region. So the region through which you will have your scent of smell. And that we think it's also important to be fair as a point of entry if you want to the direct infection of the brain as the this is funny because now I'm thinking about like my work in oxytocin and the intranasal administration of peptides. The nose is this very interesting open window to the brain because it kind of cuts off a bit the all of the barriers that we have to protect the brain from the rest of of the body. But there seems to be like something that gives some sort of access a bit quicker to things to get there. And we know that, for example, lack of smell or sense of smell is kind of frequent in people with long COVID. And I think people kind of started to, devalue a bit these observations that we had in different studies that indeed you see some sort of degeneration of these areas of the brain. And people say like, oh yeah, I mean, it's probably very obvious. Like if people don't have a sense of smell, they will not be exercising those neurons as much. So it's possible that the cortex is going to decrease because of that. So it's kind of lack of use. But what if it's not the case? It's really just the composition of those regions that actually are different and contain something that is in there that might be particularly attractive for the virus. That's a bit of one of the concepts that I would like to put forward with the data that we have been presenting. It's this concept of that even when you look at the neuroimaging data, the astrocytes regional vulnerability seems to be something that is quite present. That's quite well backed up by the postmortem data as well. And there's also, well, other initial evidence that, for example, I don't know if you have been familiar with the trials that have been conducted in long COVID, but one of the drugs that gave one initial positive result of some sort of benefit in terms of cognitive deficits was an antidepressant that is called vortioxetine. This was a trial published in Brain. But interestingly, this drug seems to be working only if people have already some sort of high levels of inflammation to start with. And guess what? Vortioxetine, in addition to being an antidepressant, also has some sort of neuroinflammatory cancelling properties. So, I think there's different pieces, bits and pieces coming from different places have now started to build up to kind of support more and more this hypothesis. I think our data is a good contribution in that respect because if you don't have a technique that will allow you to actually measure things in a living human brain or a living individual, that will allow you to track whatever is changing as a consequence of the drug, and that will eventually give you some information on whether you can predict or not if that person is going to respond to the drug or not, it's probably going to be very useful. Because I don't know if if you have been already in your experience facing this sort of issue we face in psychiatry, but pretty much what the sort of treatments that we use is one size fits all.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
while in practical terms, we know very well that probably someone with depression 50% of the time will not respond to the conventional drugs. Out of those 50 that are left out, then we will probably have 30% that will not respond to anything of the things that we have available. So I think more and more we need to start thinking about this personalized approach to treatment. And to be honest with you, I think in the context of long COVID, it makes even more sense
Hmm.
because I think we are putting in one single box probably a lot of different conditions together. It's very different the patient with long COVID that it's just a mild infection and that developed this sort of fatigue syndrome as a consequence of the mild infection than the patient that had a severe infection that was in ICU, that had probably some sort of neuropathy, post-intensive care, and we are probably talking about mechanisms that are completely different.
Yeah.
So starting to streamline these differences will be more and more important for the future. It's my conviction.
100%, and it's such a heterogeneous condition as well, and that's demonstrated by how different people's symptoms are. So some people have massively have a tendency to have symptoms that are more physical. Others will be more kind of neurological symptoms. Other will be kind of the post like tachycardia type symptoms as well. So these all these different phenotypes, and we're kind of a lot of the time just chucking it into one box and saying, "Yep, right, that's all the same thing." And the same goes for MECFS as well, because
Yes.
MECFS is kind of a diagnosis of elimination, right? And yet that can come from a variety of different triggers. So you have people with MECFS who have come from glandular fever, mono, different viruses, bacterial infections,
Yes.
stressful environments, some from kind of chronic pain onsets as well. So it does seem ludicrous that we would say, yeah, well, then maybe give them all the same kind of thing and hope that, hope that it works. But like you said, if we're measuring things, then we can give a treatment, we can assess and be like, okay, this is what's objectively changing within that person's biology, and then we
Mm-hmm.
can point the treatments more and more in line with what the data is actually telling us. And I think that is the first principles of medicine, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as working in psychiatry, I'm pretty much used to this concept of renegation. It's not only the patients that are renegated to psychiatrists; the psychiatrists themselves are also renegated within the field of medicine. So,
Mm-hmm.
and on this note, I think it's important to say that in the past we didn't know enough about the brain to understand that if you don't see something, it's not there.
Yes.
And if you see something, you will tell, well, this is for the neurologist because it's physical, it's in hardware. The sort of problems we deal with in psychiatry most of the times are what I call the software problems. So they are functional, which means that it doesn't necessarily mean that it's any less, medical or any less physical, simply just because we cannot really see
Mm-hmm.
with our eyes the changes that are happening.
Yeah. But we I think as a society as well, we kind of like things that are more tangible, right? And I think that's why kind of MECFS has been, stigmatized for a long time. It was often dismissed as being lazy, being menopausal, or whatever it might be, because we can't see it. It's not a tumor. There's not something there. It's not like a
Yeah.
broken. I spoke about this quite a few times when I broke my ankle a few years ago, and the amount of sympathy I got regarding that, everyone's like, "Oh my god, are you okay?" And I'm like, "I'm fine." It's literally, but
Yeah.
like you can see it, and that's why people are kind of yeah, more outstanding of that. Um, so when it comes to then, I just wanted to go back on over those results, right? So
Mhm.
you're seeing, just to break that down so I understand. So you're collectively across the board of the brains of the people that you have studied, you are seeing shrinking in the areas of the prefrontal frontal cortex in those with long COVID specifically, and that also maps on with the areas where there are high levels of astrocytes. Is that correct? Which
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
therefore from that would indicate potentially that the astrocytes are being there's some kind of virus in those areas of the brain, or just in the body in general. Like, how does that work?
So we know now that, for example, it's true that the virus or viral particles have been detected in the brain. So well, I think we kind of passed already that discussion. But it's important to say that you don't necessarily need the virus to be there to actually disrupt whatever is happening. So, for example, it's been a study in a rodent model of cognitive deficits post SARS-CoV-2 infection, where the only thing that you need to actually to reproduce the whole cognitive deficit phenotype is to administer, for example, the spike protein of the virus. So this means that even just the debris of the virus that persist in some part of the body would be enough to activate the cells that are in part of the brain, but that have some sort of immune function. And there we are talking about mostly astrocytes and microglia. So microglia perhaps the first let's say the first player, then the astrocytes that are no and less important in terms of immune function and immune surveillance as well. What we see, as you say, is really that is this concept of behind this sort of analysis is the concept of regional vulnerability. So we think about the brain as if the brain would be one organ, but in fact, the brain is many brains that are basically just all packed up in one. And we know that, for example, when you look at the constitution in terms of cellular composition of the different areas of the brain, they are not the same. So you will have some sort of gradients where, for example, in the frontal areas, you will see a bit more of glial cells as opposed to the posterior areas. So the ones that are a bit more here on the back part of your head. And funnily enough, that is been helping us to understand why, when you look at certain aspects of the anatomy of the brain or certain aspects of the changes in the anatomy of the brain, why is it that you see these sort of non-random patterns? Um, might it be because things are operating in a network kind of fashion, so things are connected in the brain? But at the same time, we also know that things that typically are connected in the brain, they also tend to have a cellular composition that is similar. So, it's when I say that the brain is really a fantastic organ, it's really because of this. It's because of this level of interconnectedness that the more you know, the more actually you realize that you don't know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
You realize you're just looking at an ocean of stuff to learn still.
yeah, and that isn't insatisfaction. It's actually something that doesn't leave me unsettled. It's quite the opposite. It does motivate me to try to understand more and more and more.
Mm,
And it's been fun. Honestly, it's been quite fun to work on this project in long COVID, particularly because I must say that it's probably one of the clinical populations I've worked with that is the most engaged in the research. From the moment that I've contacted the Association of Long COVID patients, uh, I had immediately a wave of responses to our request for people to come and participate in the study. And honestly, I think it's been really a pleasure to work with you guys. So just keep going what you have been doing, because even though it seems that you have not produced a lot of things, it might well be that that there will be some sort of breakthrough coming
for
in the next couple months. Yeah.
for sure, that's very very reassuring, and it's something that I think is, yeah, a real testament and a real strength actually, because there's a lot of patient communities where it's kind of fragmented and scattered a little bit, and it's the world's worst club, but in many ways it's something that we can use to our strength because they're so engaged. Whenever there's studies or things like Decode ME, or like you just mentioned, there is never going to be a problem with getting these trials done and getting volunteers because people will be on it like that. They're engaged, they're ready to go, and I think that's something that we definitely need to make use of.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
a quick question I had, because around the kind of, you mentioned then that what might be driving this kind of low grade inflammation, which is
Mhm.
obviously causing these downstream effects, potentially this kind of debris or the spike protein debris, whatever might be triggering that. Why is it the case that some people following viral infections can have this kind of debris or some kind of viral remnants in their system? We see this in mono and other illnesses like that, but then others can have it, but they do have these kind of symptoms. Is it something to do with their immune system or nervous system, how it's functioning, or like what is the kind of crossover there? Because that's something that's always been very puzzling.
Yeah, I think it's probably, I'm not going to enlighten you any further than probably you have been so far. So I think there's certainly a component that comes from the genetics, so the inter-individual differences.
Hmm.
In the case of the study that I was mentioning before in long COVID, we know that, for example, a polymorphism in a region of the toll-like receptor 4, so TL4R gene, is capable of predicting in terms of risk if someone after the infection, acute infection, is going to develop long COVID or not. So
Hmm.
that's already telling us that there's some sort of predisposition from in terms of the genetics of the immune system that is going to be an important player there. But then we need to think that, for example, accumulating and then getting rid of this debris implies a number of other systems that, for example, until very recently, we did not know about the existence of the lymphatic system
Yeah,
in the brain, which is basically just some sort of like waste clearance system
like a car
that
wash.
exactly. So, you know, we think, I personally think that it's also something that is quite important for long COVID, and that we have not studied yet properly. I have plans of doing that with the data that we collected, but there's probably a lot of mechanisms at play at the same
Hmm.
time.
Yeah.
Even like the origin of this immune activation, let's say. Eventually, some people might develop, for example, autoimmunity against themselves, and that might be a cause. For others, might be the persistence of the viral proteins. For other people, might be just because they were infected in the past with other virus that just got reactivated because of the massive immune response that they suffered during the acute infection. Um, One thing that is interesting, though, is that from the studies that we have started to see on, for example, whether the type of treatment you give to someone during the acute phase of COVID, whether it's going to determine if they are going to get long COVID or not, it seems to be the drugs that interfere directly with the viral infection and not with the immune system, the ones that seem to decrease the most the risk of having
Hmm.
long COVID. So this kind of indicates that perhaps there's some sort of a link, kind of direct link with the amount of viral particles that at some point are formed.
Okay.
But this is on research ongoing.
Okay.
So
So if you had to hazard a guess about what is, because we're obviously hoping in terms of long term, looking towards treatments and things like that. If you had to hazard a guess, again, it's very difficult to say, but would you imagine it is likely a case of trying to get rid of this virus and then allowing the system to kind of settle down and calm down, or do you think maybe it's more of a case of addressing that inflammation? And because I know a lot of people who do kind of things to tackle that inflammation, whether it be like even cold showers and things like that, there is a very momentary reduction, like a huge reduction in that kind of the symptoms because of that
mhm.
reduction in the inflammation. Do you think it's maybe a case of reducing that inflammation and then allowing the body to heal? What kind of avenue do you think? Again, it's very difficult to say, but what would be your guess?
Well, money allowing, I had already some hypotheses about what we could potentially explore in this context.
Okay.
I think we will probably be facing the challenge of the fact that biological systems, they have an intrinsic memory, and they get primed. So it's a way that our immune system, as of the second time or the third time or the fourth time that it contacts with something that is not supposed to be there, will be a bit more efficient in dealing with pathogens. And this is not any different for the microglia, which effectively is a cell that is very similar to the macrophage. So the one of the cells of the immune system that work a lot at the periphery. This means what? This means that once you start the cycle, then resettling that balance point it can be a bit complicated. But we do have drugs, and we do have already quite a lot of experience with the treatments that are modulators of the brain immune response. And I'm not talking necessarily about pharmacological treatments. Even like, for example, changing some aspects of your nutrition, we know that it might produce some positive effect in terms of neuroinflammation. So, without being disclosing here too much about what my ideas are for moving forward, because otherwise, unfortunately, we'll not get the funding you know, you might be very passionate about something, but then you
Yeah.
necessarily need to have, to have the funding to actually then put things into practice. But I think there's definitely ways of moving this forward.
Okay. Okay.
And using drugs that are already approved, that the only thing we probably would need to do is some sort of repurposing, which is always the most ideal scenario. So
Yes.
in terms of cost effectiveness,
Hmm.
but there's definitely scope there.
Hmm.
And I mean, I can see from our experience that there's been a bit more of sensibility towards the funding in research in this area, with the emergency of long COVID. Before MECFS has been, the patients have passed quite difficult times, and also the research in terms of finding the means to actually just keep things going.
Yes.
But I think long COVID actually was positive in that respect for the patients with MECFS, that now, as part of all the same community, have now the opportunity of helping each other in fighting a bit this battle, which is difficult
Yeah.
to fight.
I think there'll be crossovers. I mean, there'll be a breakthrough for one is a breakthrough for the other. I think it's going to be, and yeah, I think there's, because like you said, there's actually tons of potential drug, because the whole drug development process from start to finish is a long old process that costs tons of money. You need drug companies that are invested in it, but repurposing is really where we can get some small quick wins for long COVID
Yeah,
and chronic fatigue syndrome, because there is tons of drugs out there which, like you said, can be repurposed relatively inexpensively and relatively easily on a much shorter time span, whether it be 2-3 years. And I think that's where we need to focus our the resources at the moment. And that's what I'm trying to do with I think this, because I think that's an area that we can target.
yeah,
But then,
yeah.
so would you say though your aim in general is like about dampening inflammation, or is it more about addressing viral persistence? Can you disclose that much, or is that too much of a giveaway?
I think from my own experience and from what we generally know, probably trying to modulate inflammation would be easier for us with the tools
Yes.
that we have now.
Yeah.
So, SARS-CoV-2 is a virus that just came up like a few years ago. We have hundreds of yeah, so if you think about things a bit more traditional, we probably have hundreds of years of experience in dealing with inflammation. So I would probably go a bit more towards that direction. But for sure, if we find the way of working on the side of this clearance of the viral particles, if that's really the culprit, because
Yeah.
the question is, it might be the culprit, but not for everyone.
Yeah, that is yeah, that's right. And also I think that's a signal with, because certain people with MECFS, for example, they have had they have been triggered by not a virus necessarily as well. So what is it in that case? Again, like you said, is it reactivation? Is it this autoimmunity? Is it the nervous system going haywire? So I think, but yeah, I guess like you said, inflammation is a good a good place to start.
Especially because I mean, I have a student, Rosario, who's been like doing an immense job actually of going through all the literature and neuroimaging studies across the post-infection syndrome. So
Hmm.
we kind of started to see, let's think a bit more broadly speaking. So let's take into consideration long COVID, Lyme disease, all sort of fatigue syndromes that can be triggered by an infection. And what we see is that even though the agents are quite different from each other, there's some sort of kind of coherence about the areas of the brain that typically are detected to be abnormal using neuroimaging techniques. And interestingly enough, the suspects are more or less always the same. Like things like the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, which we know as a matter of fact that are regions that are super important to encode things that come from the body. So that come from the body and that also control what is happening in the body. For example, you can activate and deactivate immune response just by manipulating a bunch of neurons in the insula, because that sort of triggering and alarm triggering is all encoded in the neuropopulation that is present there. So I think more and more the data kind of converge on the idea that potentially there's some sort of interaction in the brain that is present and that happens through what we call the inflammable brain, if you want, which is
Hmm.
like these regions of the brain that are particularly prone or that deal with the information that comes from the body and goes to the body.
Hmm. Okay, that's super interesting. Yeah, I saw. I think I saw a study around that with rodents as well, with a similar kind of thing. I think that leads us quite nicely onto the next topic that I wanted to touch upon, because you touched there about the insula, and I think it's a really interesting area, and it ties quite nicely, I think, with chronic pain and this study, which I mentioned to you beforehand, that I would love to discuss, because I've seen a lot of stuff about it. You hear a lot of people discussing it, and for those who don't know, it's the chronic back pain study, where they essentially used this kind of pain reprocessing therapy, which is a
Mm-hmm.
kind of I guess you'd call it sort of psychological intervention.
Mm-hmm.
And you hear a lot about people trying to use things like meditation to try and alleviate symptoms, and things like that. Now, obviously, like chronic pain is a different thing to conditions like this, where you've got the immune system, everything going on. Okay, you're saying, but I would love to get your thoughts on first of all that study and the kind of legitimacy of that study, and how that actually was working, because from the data of the study it looked like it was very successful. And then on the second part, like we say, whether there is any crossovers between that and conditions like long COVID, ME/CFS, because I think it's a very interesting area of discussion, but also one that I'm glad to get a professional's insight on, because but often it's a dangerous, kind of a topic to walk around, because the last thing that we want to be doing is saying this is psychological, this is just you making it up, which I think is often what talking about that is sometimes conflated as. So
But
yeah.
sometimes you can be making up things without even knowing that you are making up things. So
Yes.
it's what I call the concept of Bayesian brain. So we all have some sort of, uh, pre-concepts of pre-probabilities about what the world is looking like. And then you contrast this model of the world with the evidence that comes through your sensory channels. And then you create some sort of what you call prediction errors, which is like, okay, how accurate my model of the world is. And sometimes this is sufficient to explain something as worrying as, for example, someone having a functional seizure. Like, what is it that people suffer with when they have this functional neurological disorder, and that people say like they are just pretending? Well, maybe they are just not pretending. It's just that their software is not working the way that it's supposed to be working. And the more we know about how the brain works, and also from a quantitative perspective, because I think one of the things that we have seen in the past years that we have not seen before is really this attempt of bringing a level of precision that only the mathematicians normally have and the physicists,
Hmm.
trying to formulate the problems as they actually can be formulated in mathematical terms. And this study on pain is nothing more than, I think, a good example of the power of the mind in that respect. or the power of your brain in that respect. Let's think, for example, about the placebo effect.
Mm-hmm.
Placebo effect is a very strong and powerful thing. I don't know if you have ever come across with this literature, but I mean, typically we talk about the placebo effect in the trials for pain drugs, but even like someone with Parkinson can be treated on a placebo for 6 months and actually improve. And it's not until 6 months that actually then you start to see that people that have been on the placebo will decline in terms of motor function, while the ones that are kept on a drug that is stimulating the dopaminergic system will stay without progression of the disease. This what is it that this is telling us is that the power of the beliefs, and by beliefs I'm referring to these computations or these
Mm-hmm.
expectations that our brain makes about something, is quite powerful. And it's quite powerful and recruits a lot of the neurotransmitters that we know to be important for example, for the processing of pain. The dopamine system is important for the processing of pain. It's stimulated by pain. Increases in the levels of dopamine typically lead to decreases of level of pain. And there's also then another aspect to it about this trial, which I think is quite interesting, which is the fact that our brains, they are learning machines.
Mm-hmm.
You will associate, even when you don't want to associate things, you will associate them. And if for some reason, let's say that I'm struggling with anxiety, today I left home and I had an accident at the outside, and your brain will automatically think that the next time you will step out, there's a high probability that thing is going to happen. And you need to basically to feed your brain with constant information, proving the opposite, for your
Yeah.
brain to be convinced that statistically that's not the most likely or the most probable event. The same thing happens with pain. For example, someone that suffers with pain or even with fatigue will learn at some point that exert themselves will cause them pain, will cause them fatigue. And that will contribute to the plasticity of the neural systems that is implemented as part of the learning process, and that only this sort of contrast with the evidence from the environment can actually kind of contrapose and provide another different perspective. And that's one of the reasons why sometimes the CBT enters and might bring some benefit. Because what is it that we try to do with CBT? We just try to understand whether there's some sort of thought or action pattern that is perhaps not very functional for you,
Mm-hmm.
that we might address or might change in a way that might make things work better. That's the only thing that that the CBT is really trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Nothing more, nothing else than trying to a bit work out with this statistical process that our brain typically computes all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I know that this is a bit disappointing for someone that like to think about psychological therapy as someone that is a bit more mystical, but I honestly I don't believe it's the case. It's just like we humans being very smart and using something that our brains just came up with probably many years ago during evolution, which is
Mm-hmm.
this sort of statistical machinery that just tries to predict whatever is happening in the world all the time. And the better you are in predicting what is going to happen, in principle, the better you will be in surviving. And
Yes.
that's all we need and we want species.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I agree. We are essentially kind of these machine learning, yeah, mechanisms that are just constantly absorbing more and more data. So I wanted to go back to a part within that study which I found quite interesting towards the end, because obviously the group compared to I think the standard treatment for this chronic back pain was exercises and things like that, and then the group who underwent this pain reprocessing therapy, a significant reported that their pain had either diminished or basically gone. But then there was also quite an interesting part where they then measured the brain's response to external stimulus, so to pain itself, and they measured the areas within the brain that were being sensitive to an external stimuli, and they noticed a huge like opposite with those who had undergone that therapy. So within within that case, then is there what is happening on a kind of physiological level there? Because obviously they haven't had any pharmacological interventions, but there seems to be this kind of change in how their brain is processing pain and how it's responding to pain.
The best pharmacological intervention you can find possible. It's really the biology working. So I'm very comfortable in speaking about this topic because actually I started doing my research in chronic pain. I was still a medical student back in the days, so we're talking about probably around 2009 when I started doing research, and we were a group that was focused on something that we called descending pain modulation, which is how the brain actually modulates the way that the painful information is transmitted from the back of your spinal cord all the way up to the brain itself. In a lot of these regions, where are they located? In the brainstem, to start with. So right here, you have a kind of a first gateway of nuclei that can project neurotransmitters down to the spinal cord and block the transmission of the information already there. So that painful information will not even reach the brain up here. But there's a lot of cognitive areas in the prefrontal cortex that, for example, have the capacity of doing the same through influencing these areas in the brainstem. And that's why we talk about, for example, the nocebo effect. So, for example, let's say that I'm going to make you a little stitch. And I will tell you that, Harry, I'm a psychiatrist. I'm really bad in doing this. And it's very likely going to be very, very painful. It's going to be very, very painful. You will see that even though it could be not even me doing the procedure, if you would have your eyes closed, but it would be excruciating the pain that you will be feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because the facilitatory systems of the descending modulation path in the brain to the spinal cord are already working to enhance the amount of nociceptive information that is going to go up to the brain. The same thing happens if, for example, I'll tell you, like, Harry, you really like the sea, you like go surfing. Just think about the sea and surfing while I do the stitch. You'll be more relaxed. You'll probably be thinking about positive things, positive emotions, which will stimulate then the descending inhibitory arch of the system, blocking the information that is going to be perceived in the brain. So it's not actually by a stigma that we treat or we recommend people with chronic pain to take antidepressants. And this has nothing to do with the depression itself that can very often be comorbid with the chronic pain. Is simply because we know that, for example, serotonin and noradrenaline, which are produced in the brainstem, they are also projected to the spinal cord in order to inhibit the relay of the painful information that goes up to the brain. And by using an antidepressant or a drug that has been commercialized for depression, actually you can achieve what the biological system is achieving by using the neurotransmitters and the serotonin and noradrenaline.
Okay, so you're essentially kind of allowing it to be kind of reprogrammed and act as it kind of should do. And okay, like that's actually because I remember reading about I think this was when the placebo, or at least there's a good story about it anyway. But when this placebo effect was discovered, and I think it was in the war, was it World War I or World War II? And they run out of morphine, and so the doctor went and filled it up with salt water, and he stuck it into them and started just sawing their legs and doing these operations. And like you said, because they had this kind of preemptive precursor that meant that was what, like you said, from top down was to be expected.
Yeah.
But that is very interesting then that
Let's put things into practice here, Ari. If I throw you at the let's say in a place where you have to face let's say very dangerous animals, you have been injured. You need to fight for your survival and just fight or fly the quickest that you can from that region. You cannot really give yourself the chance or the possibility of being struggling too much with the pain in order to be functional. You just need to move on. And that's one of the reasons why I love biology, because it's simple but it's effective. And things do not need to be extremely complex in order to be effective. So if you think, well, it's just really biology.
I think that's where the line's often lost. It's yeah, like you said, it's labeled as this kind of woo woo, but no, that's very very interesting. Um,
For example,
Dan,
this going back to the link with the long COVID. I mean, most of the patients that I had with long COVID, they would probably meet the criteria for fibromyalgia.
hmm
And there's a lot of overlap, for example, in terms of symptoms. I do have the conviction that probably, there's some sort of share quota in the mechanisms that contribute to both conditions. But again, it wasn't until recently that we find out that, for example, if I take the autoantibodies that are produced by a patient with fibromyalgia and I infect an animal with that serum, actually, the animals develop some sort of painful syndrome that the patients show, which means that, again, we can only know what we don't know. There's
hmm
many other things that we don't know that we cannot be sure that we don't know about. So I think, as everything else in science, in medicine, we need to be humble enough to admit our stupidity, as I normally say, and our ignorance, and that knowing that sometimes you just don't know. You just don't understand it. And the
hmm
fact that you don't understand it doesn't make it any less valid than actually anything else.
for sure, and also it shouldn't stop us from trying to deal with and tackle with what we do know. For example, we know about the inflammation, we know that the potential around the viral persistence, we can target that. We know around these benefits of the kind of chronic pain interventions. We know, like you said, about pharmacological interventions, and we can try to target what we do know and help what we do know,
Mhm.
and whilst tirelessly working to find out more and more about the things that we don't as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That's my conviction, my professional conviction. I think it's in general a very good principle of approaching things.
Amazing. Daniel, thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
Likewise.
I think for our viewers, if they wanted to hear a little bit more about the work that you do, where can they find you?
So there's you can find me on Twitter. So I have my professional page where I normally share a lot of my scientific work. There's also my research page where they can find just look for Daniel Martins, King's College London, or the mostly BRC, which is where I'm based now right now. And I mean, I would say keep an eye because we'll probably be a lot of stuff coming out in the next few months. So a lot of this long COVID stuff that I've been working on. To be honest, this stays kind of tirelessly. It's We are going to start to release it over the next couple of weeks, and I think there's some stuff with potential that I would certainly be keen to discuss with people that actually struggle because the work that I do without the patients does not have any meaning.
hmm
So the patients are bring the questions,
hmm
and I think it's more and more we need to work together, not against each other. And sometimes, I do have some. We all do have some struggles because the patients. As a consequence of their frustration with the lack of advance, sometimes they can become a bit impatient. But if there's something that I would like to, a message that I would like to leave to people today is that come to us, speak to us, tell us what is it that is bothering you, that is you are struggling with, because those are the material that we work with, the questions.
Amazing. That's a very kind sentiment, and yeah, I'm sure people will be super super grateful. I will put all the links in the description. I hope that everyone enjoyed that. I certainly did, and I'm sure we'll be back on the channel again at some point. Down, I think like we've got a lot to talk about. But I hope you guys enjoyed, and we'll see you again soon.